All right, lightning talk, so I have to be quick. I'm usually a long-winded speaker, so this is uncomfortable for me. But thanks for coming. Thanks for having me for the award and so on. I'm Ahmad Alsahaf. I'm from the Van Tiefmans group at the UMCG cell biology department. And what we do is we do microscopy. In my case, it's electron microscopy, so that's what the EM stands for. And I'd like to tell you a bit about how we very recently tried to make more of an effort to make things fair, FAIR, fair data. So I'm sure you're familiar with Google Earth, right? So this looks like probably a still from the movie The Martian, but it's actually the town where I grew up. So, you know, I come from the desert. And since it's Google Earth, what we can do, if the video works, which it doesn't, right, it does work. So we can move from one zoomed in view to another right to the venue where we are now. It's very handy. I'm sure you've used it before, even in Google Maps, just to give directions. So the idea, maybe you might be thinking, I hope you're thinking, what if we could do that for the human body? You know, we could zoom in at different organs, different organelles, zoom into the different cells within the organs, and look and understand how the body works, understand diseases, hopefully help finding cures. And that's exactly what we do. You're in luck. Or what we try to do. This is the long-term goal of the group, is to do that. So we image with very high-tech electron microscopes and also light microscopes, and we collect all this data, right? So potentially this would be the kind of interface, very Google Earth-like. So these are the state-of-the-art electron microscope instruments that we use. They collect a lot of data. I mean, I couldn't really overstress, but I didn't want to put in any numbers because, again, lightning talk, but it's a lot of data. So just to give you sort of a sense of how large the data is, I'm not the person imaging because I'm not a microscopist or biologist. Something that is literally the size of the eye of a needle, the image of it would be maybe half the size of this room. So it's really ridiculous. And that would be, you know, one cell, one organ out of the body, out of one organism. So it could be humans and non-human animals as well. So yeah, and the images are zoomable. If you don't believe me, I have another video, which I also hope works, right? So this is the kind of interfaces we're dealing with now. You can zoom out, take a very deep view, but also get the sort of bigger context, look at different samples from different patients in this case. These are samples from patients, from the pancreas of patients that had type 1 diabetes. So we had this pipeline. So there's typically a scientific publication and some data associated with it. So the publication typically would describe a lot of the experimental metadata, how the sample was prepared, what imaging technique was used, and then in the paper itself, as probably a lot of you know, is just a screenshot of these images, so the screenshots of your results. But we try to also publish the raw data on a locally hosted sort of repository or server called anatomy.org. Anatomy stands for nano anatomy, so that's what we host our data typically. But this is still kind of the group's local website, and we wanted to take things a step further to make them more fair. So then, you know, because fair data principles quite incentivize, and because they are the right thing to do. So this is what we've been trying to do. So we had this pilot case, and that's what we applied for this award for. So in order to do that, there was a lot of efforts, and this is a very elaborate pipeline, including making custom software, which is also freely available on GitHub for hopefully other people to hook on. And we also share it with other members of the microscopy community in the Netherlands and also across the world, hopefully. So they use it to, and what this software does is it converts the data, the image data that comes from microscopes, from the proprietary formats of the microscopes to something more open, or specifically something called OME-TIFF. The O in OME stands for open. It's open microscopy environment. So this is again, also a group of people that are pushing open data, specifically in the field of microscopy. So we get the data to this format so that it's more fair. And at the end, we can publish it both at our local repository, but also in public image repositories that sort of comply a lot more than we could have with fair data principles, especially with linking metadata. And for that, we also use the custom model for metadata to link everything together. So one more point is that why are we collecting so much data? So you might say this is a bit excessive, which it is now, but this has to do with the prospects of the future. One obvious usage is the reuse in other studies, which is already happening for data that we shared. But the other one is that what is really the potential, and what our team leader likes to call the other fair, future AI ready. He loves to play with acronyms and so on. So this has to do with another acronym, FOMO, fear of missing out. So maybe the data now cannot be fully exploited because the technology is simply not there. But there are a lot of machine learning algorithms being developed, and one day this really excessive amount of data might help better analysis and better, hopefully cure for diseases, because these are all linked to medical applications. So that's the reason we're collecting data. One example of AI or machine learning in these data sets is segmentation. So you could really analyze and count different organelles in the cell instead of doing it manually. Back to the normal fare. So a lot of criteria, some of you know, hard to maybe follow, but I decided to have a look at one of them. I thought was relevant. Provenance, metadata and data needs to be associated with detailed provenance. I caught my attention because I didn't know what provenance meant. So it means for others to use your data, they should know where the data came from, i.e. you need to have a clear origin and history. It's like it's a superhero, you need the origin story. So the data is the superhero in this case. So this is our first pilot study of verifying our data. It's from the MPOD database, which is a database of pancreatic samples of patients with type 1 or type 2 diabetes. So this is what I think we accomplished very well. We have the clear history. So if you look at the publication itself, you know who, of course, was involved in this study, and this actually happened before my involvement. And then you know what we have the biobank that, of course, they do a lot of work to collect this data, and of course you also know the technical details about the instrument. But most importantly, we also link with the available and obviously anonymized patient data, and this is the origin. So these are obviously donors that are no longer alive. So in this case, I think provenance is really relevant, and verifying the data is a way of sort of honoring the sacrifice of the donors and hopefully potentially helping other scientists come up with better solutions for the disease. In this case, a very not so well understood disease like type 1 diabetes. And that's it for me for today. I'd like to thank these people and these logos. A lot of collective work. I'm just representing them here today. Thank you.
There is some time for questions. Are there any questions? I take a look at but it relates to the question that has been asked before. But I think it's great that you share, of course, that you share the material, your raw material. You said it's almost excessive. But then related to the competitive environments, you've already shown that it's reused.
Yeah.
How does it feel for you that other people are using your materials and when they write that paper you can't?
Yeah, we have those discussions internally a lot. Not so much for the data itself, but when you actually do a study based on the data, and you think, well, I can either sort of think of all the follow-ups and do them myself, and to prevent others from doing the follow-ups, you withhold the data because the publication will be out there, but you can withhold the raw data. But I would say if somebody was to do that follow-up, let them, because again, this is about curing disease. I'm not trying to make it, give it bigger weight than actually. Again, it is also academic research. We're not curing type 1 diabetes tomorrow, but in a sense, yes. I don't feel any drive to prevent others from taking this and going with it. Even also for the software, so we made this I mainly made the converter of this, the format converter, which was a lot of work, but I'd love for somebody with more software development background to develop it further because I don't have time for it anymore. So we put it on GitHub and then it's open for the network. Yeah, it's a bit niche, so it's not like anybody will go work on it, but hopefully someone from the network will cross this.
Alright. And ask how you looked at how many, better question, how many or formats or closed formats have you looked into that you can actually
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's not yet universal, the converter. So we get questions a lot from other microscopy labs in the Netherlands, especially because we're part of a consortium that tells, oh, can you convert this thing that comes from that particular manufacturer, microscope vendor? And sometimes we can help them, sometimes we can't. And also another technical thing is that these microscopy images come in very different configurations. So you have 3D images that are stacks of images, and you have time series images. So, and there is no kind of one size fits all solution. Either like a commercial solution or open source, and hopefully we kind of can contribute in there being a solution in the future, but it doesn't exist yet. So even our converter handles a few specific cases. They are general enough, so for any large scale 2D images from any microscope can work, but not for some others.
have you received? Oh, sorry, have you received help or any sort of help from manufacturers?
No, not quite actually. It's well, there is kind of a communication with them for other things, but yeah, they're busy working on their own solutions, of course, and they also care more about their own proprietary formats. But they help, they make machines. So yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned already that the data set has already been used. I was wondering whether you've also set some kind of regulations for how it is being used, or whether you have any kind of control over that, how you manage it.
Well, no, it is under. So, for example, now that it exists in this repository called the IDR, image data resource, which is somewhat microscopy specific, open data set repository. They have their own license type, and whatever fits under that license, I forgot what it is exactly, is fair game. So I don't think they could do with it something so outlandish. I mean, it's a biological sample. It's just they get access to the raw image. So hopefully they do something with it.
All right, thank you. We are out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation and replies to the questions. So,
Yeah.
awesome. Go on with our next talk. Next item talk is Aranka Ballering and team from UMCG, the Psychiatry department. And they have an interesting case which involves local science and information with qualitative research. Aranka and team.
Congratulations on your video. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
few days. Jullie. Nobody responds.
Well, good afternoon all. My name is Ballering. Usually when I'm standing in front of people, I'm talking about sex and gender differences in health, and now it's something completely out of my comfort zone. So I hope you'll bear with me. But I want to start off with this matrix. And I don't know who of you out here is a fan of American military history. I am not necessarily, but I'm lending their catchphrases, so to say. And this is Rumsfeld's matrix. He was 2002 Secretary of Defense during the Iraq War, and he came up, or he made somewhat bigger the ideas of known knowns and unknown unknowns. And when we talk about known knowns, we talk about what we know, and as scientists, we usually love to tell about what we know. There are also unknown knowns, and I usually compare these to 90s song lyrics. Once I'm stuck in traffic and a 90s Backstreet Boys song comes on, I don't know how it happens, but somehow I can lip sync every single word of the song. So there are things I know that I'm not aware of. There are also unknown unknowns. We don't usually talk about these. We don't usually think about these, and we're not really aware of these. There are things we don't know. And then there are known unknowns. And here's actually where our open science practices come to play, if you were wondering. But there are known unknowns. In the military, we usually actively steer away from these because of possible liability. But in science, we don't have that luxury. We want to push our known unknowns towards known knowns. And that's actually what we try to do with our open research practices, because our research project is about how social interactions in childhood and early adolescence shape someone's symptoms proneness in later life. And what better way to assess that than via a large qualitative interview study? And what better way to make your qualitative interview study verifiable and credible and trustworthy than to pre-register it? However, this was our big known unknown, because we were aware of the fact of pre-registering, but only in quantitative data. We actually had no clue how to do this when it came to qualitative data. Because qualitative research in itself is inherently iterative. There's a constant need for redevelopment and redefining your research methods, but also your data collection. And data collection in itself in qualitative research is arguably an inconsistent process, because as an interviewer, as a researcher, you're an extension of your measurement instrument, of your interview scheme, basically. But everyone has different triggers, has different associations with regards to the narratives of participants, but also a different interview style. So all this flexibility, and when we started out with our qualitative research projects, used to call it structured chaos, because I could not see what was going on as a quantitative researcher. But all this flexibility in my mind interfered with the whole idea of pre-registering research, because there is no predefined hypothesis, because there was no predefined data collection method or analysis method. And also, pre-registration was associated to reproducibility. However, reproducibility is not a core core component of qualitative research. Qualitative research is more about trustworthiness and knowing, and not necessarily about reproducibility, because qualitative research is done in a certain place, a certain time, a certain society. And if you want to reproduce it, you're already somewhat later in a somewhat more changed society. So there were some challenges when it came to the prevailing forms of pre-registration in relation to qualitative research. First off, predefined hypotheses were absent. Qualitative research is more about generating hypotheses. It's more about the how and the why and what of certain phenomena. So there were no predefined hypotheses. Sometimes there aren't even predefined research questions, and there were no predefined, there were predefined data collection methods, but we were able to deviate from these. Also, because of these deviations, data analysis and data collection are sort of interwoven and they affect one another very strongly. And lastly, there's a high level of subjectivity, as I just explained. The researcher has its own connotations to the story of a participant. So we weren't really sure whether we should, could, or would pre-register our research. In the end, we did. And we aim to make our pre-registration a rolling document. So we realized that pre-registering our qualitative research didn't mean that we had to abandon our flexibility. As long as we clearly motivated why we deviated from the protocol and how we deviated from our protocol, we could still pre-register our research. And every researcher has its own view, it has its own frame of reference, and works in its own research paradigm, basically. And a pre-registration is the perfect way of explicating someone's own viewpoint. So in the end, we realized that a pre-registration of qualitative research actually allows for scrutiny, and it allows for people to see what we're actually doing, what we plan to do, how we deviated from the protocol, why we deviated from the protocol. And it only increases the trustworthiness of our research. So by doing so, by creating this rolling pre-registration, by creating a version that we could build further upon, we actually push our known unknown towards a known known. And with that, I also like to end, and I hope that if you're involved in qualitative research, you're not as hesitant to pre-register it as we were in the beginning. Even though I'm standing up here, we're doing this with a team. So Judith Rosmalen, Elske van Doorn, Sterre van Giel, Sarah Burke, and Donald van Tol are also involved in this research project. And with that, I'd like to end this talk.
Are there any questions for Aranka?
Right, so this is really interesting. And I was wondering to what extent how do reviewers respond to this pre-registration aspect? Like, do they appreciate it or not, or are they still a bit confused? So I'm wondering how the situation is, because the pre-registration of quantitative studies is a bit more common now, but qualitative is new, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very new. So it's also the first time we did it. We're far from the peer review stage, yet we're still doing interviews. So I'm also very curious to see how reviewers will react. But I do think it gives them the opportunity to see what we did, to really scrutinize our research, and to really, if they have the time, dive deeper into it and see what our protocol is. So I only hope it will aid in peer reviewing, but yeah, I'm also curious to see how peer reviewers will react. Yeah.
So I do have a question. As I understand it, pre-registration is done in some external database or something. The formats they use was pre-registering qualitative research problem there, or did the format allow the extras that you introduced?
There was a format for qualitative research. We did amend it somewhat to be more explicit and to add more details. There was a very preliminary format for it on Alsahaf.
I do have a. I do have a question for you. It's not related to your research, but it's related to the lottery system. Winning a prize or an award using a lottery system. I'm curious, how is it for you to win based on luck? Yeah, you get our point is you would have won it anyway based on luck, partly in the old system. How was it for you?
Yeah, of course, it's partly based on luck, but it's also partly based on merit, because you only drew from those who adhere to the criteria, I think. So, yeah, in that sense, it's a bit odd to win only based on luck and not on what you've done, but because you only draw from a pool of people that, adhere to certain criteria and standards that you set, I'm fairly happy about it.
Do you think the feeling would have been different if there was no lottery and you were the?
Yeah, I'm not sure actually, because I think it's because as you told us already, the topics of the applications range from, well, for example, electronic microscopy, so that's a difficult word, microscopy, to qualitative research, to, I think we're going to another sort of ethnographic, from what I read, study. So I think it's actually only fun that you know such a wide range of topics. So, yeah. I did see a question from Vera, actually. I'm not sure whether we have time.
Well, it was actually quite the same. I was wondering. It was the same question as you had, because it was regarding the template that you used at, when you pre-registered. Because I was wondering as well, like, it's great that you pre-register qualitative research, because usually, typically, what you said is quantitative. So I was wondering what there were templates. Are there multiple? Is there one? Could you give a recommendation on which one did you choose and why?
We went for the only one we were aware of, that which was the one on the set actually. That was the only template we were aware of. It was still pretty broad and pretty preliminary template, so we did add some more.
Okay. Oh, but it's already incorporated in POSIT. That's nice.
See, it was right there. We could
Maybe I can add some. I mean, if there was one, you know, like maybe online audience. Yeah.
There was only one template and we used that, but yeah, on OSF you get a timestamp once you've registered. It was not really, wasn't really out there yet. I think was the rolling document that we are planning on using. So I think this is a bit new. I think it really fits qualitative research.
All right, then we go to our last winner, Doornbos.
Change the.
Oh, of course, yes,
slide,
that's
you know,
you.
like,
Oh, that was a big one.
First things first.
Very
Congratulations. Yeah, I give the floor to you. This is another diverse and different topic, so very interesting to hear your talk.
It's a bit awkward, but it works. Yeah, so my name is Doornbos. I'm a lecturer at University College Groningen and a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Spatial Sciences. And I'm here today also on behalf of Dr. Bettina van Hoven and former UCG students Kiek Bolvaar and Vlasco. So the project that I'm going to tell you about is a book project that we created together, and I'm going to share what kind of open practices were related to that. So the starting point for this project was my PhD research, which is about post-colonialism in Dutch context. And more specifically, it focuses on people of a mixed Indonesian and Dutch background. So these individuals are descendants of relations between European men and Indonesian women in the 350 years of Dutch colonial presence in Indonesia. So after the independence of Indonesia, these individuals, these families came to the Netherlands, taking with them these memories of war violence, racialized violence, and displacement. So what I did within my PhD is that I studied 21 Indo-European families across 3 generations. And what I actually did is to uncover how these family histories, how they still influence current generations living in the Netherlands, and how these histories are transmitted from one generation to the next. So as a geographer, I scrutinize different aspects of everyday life to see how this large history has an effect on really the small scale everyday life. So what I actually found is that lots of parts of these histories are often silent, both within Dutch society as a whole, but also within families themselves. Yet they play really important roles still in their everyday lives. And if you look at the Dutch society in the 1950s and 60s, when these families came, they were mostly seen as a burden of a past that they were eager to forget, and they were mostly busy with, well, reconstructions after the Second World War. And for these families themselves, they were just busy with, well, adaptation and making it in another country, which left, well, there were no conversations between generations about histories about the country they've left. And this left next generations with often limited knowledge about, well, their family histories, and then also next generations struggled with articulating who they were and who they wanted to be. So what actually happened during these interviews is that participants often stressed to me that they wanted their stories to be heard, that they wanted more attention for them, both within society, but also within families themselves. They wanted to break these silences, and that also fits the current time frame with, well, debates on decoloniality, on racism. So they wanted more attention. And also for myself, I heard all these incredible stories of 21 families, multiple generations, and I also felt, well, perhaps the burden a bit to do something with that past, well, boring academic outputs. So that's where this book project came in. So the idea was that it's a participatory action research. The idea was to involve participants in the creation of the book. So the idea was to give each family a chapter, and they could decide what part of their histories they wanted to share. They could decide themselves on the form, on the actual content. So it was up to them to share for their histories, what they found urgent or relevant, right? So we kept it completely open. And so their voice and their agency was central. So this has resulted in a really big variety of stories. So we have, for instance, life stories, overviews of participants' histories, family trees. We have conversations between generations, as you can see below. But we have also reflections on personal photographs, personal documents, but also speeches that have been given earlier, but that were now, well, physically recognized in a book. So the book was distributed among participants, but they also received extra copies to decide themselves who they wanted to share their stories with, right? So we really left it up to them to share their stories. But also the physical aspect, the physical book was something that they could share across generations, physical recognition of their stories that could be passed on. So we actually worked together with staff, students, and participants. And because of this format, and also because of all these open practices, this caused lots of challenges, because, well, there were no traditional boundaries between, well, a researcher and a subject, so to say, right? So there were constant reflexivity meetings to discuss certain challenges. And also, for instance, the data we were working with included lots of traumatic stories, but also lots of personal documents. So within the process, we discussed how to do justice to the stories of participants, but keeping in mind their anonymity, but also their wishes. But also, how do you involve participants within this project? How do you make clear what we perhaps expect of them and what they can expect from us? But how can we also make that realistic? Because it was all kind of a small book. So throughout this process, we kept on reflecting. And that's something that we have learned through this process because of these participatory and open research practices. I think especially for qualitative research, it requires well, adaptability and critical reflection on, well, how you conduct research and how you interact with participants what an appropriate relationship is between researchers and participants. And it requires these constant reflexivity on ethics, on positionality, on power relations, on knowledge production. So we're currently writing an article. So I'm writing this together with the two students to write down all of these experiences so others can learn from it too. So I would like to end with a quote from one of the women who contributed to the book, and she stated, "By writing down experiences from our past, I can give voice to the silent yet influential past of our parents." And this is what we have tried to do, try to emphasize and bring attention to the silence part of Dutch history. Thanks. So this is the link to the book, but I also brought 5 copies if anyone's interested.
Are there any questions?
Yes, thank you for your inspirational talk. I was wondering, because you're writing an article about all the experiences you've had as researchers and including your participants, did you keep a logbook or something about all the stories? Because I think you've had too many experiences to all write down in an article.
Yes. There were these multiple. So we kept a field diary. So after each thing, we wrote down findings, but we also had, after each phase, the project included various phases. We had meetings together with, the students and I to discuss how the phase went and our reflections on that. So reflexivity was something that happened in all stages, but we made it more rigorous or systematic by having indeed a field diary, but also these set times to actually discuss our reflections.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I would like to, I guess that you communicated a lot with participants on your openness goals. And I wonder whether, because of this communication, you decided to change some of your goals. So things that you intended to do more openly, that you did then after, perhaps after discussing with them, to become a little bit less open, or taking another approach in openness. Or maybe when you had reservations of your own regarding openness, then because of what they said, you became more open towards sharing some of their experiences or materials.
Yeah, definitely. And I think here the importance of reflexivity as a researcher comes in as well, because you have to deal with certain ethical considerations that come up that you have to make decisions on. So for instance, one chapter, the family that they wrote their own piece, and it was really strongly written. It included lots of violence within the household, and included lots of really personal stories, which I was wondering about whether they should have, whether it should be that explicit, but also they wanted their names there. They wanted their first name and their last name there. And I think there, the importance of the researcher comes in, is that I try to emphasize, do you understand how open this is going to be? Are you okay with being that open? Right, so these were examples where we had to discuss with participants, like, do you actually grasp what the idea is of the book, and are you still then okay with it? There, we discussed and found a middle ground that worked. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question over here. So yeah, I was curious that the participants, they had control about their own piece, right?
Yeah.
But they did not have control about what others gave us. Did that give tension? Because there is a context, of course.
I think it makes a really interesting book, and that's something I stressed as well in the introduction, that some stories might be contradicting. But I think that's also makes the book, I believe, interesting, that there's a dialogue and also an idea of not every person, not every generation, not every family having same experiences, but just highlighting that there are differences and that these differences are allowed to be there. Yeah.
yeah, I guess that was explicitly your goal. I've read part of the book. You do not reflect on their stories in the book, right? It's just
It's just for them, because that's what I do in the academic output. But I think this was just for them, and everyone should be.
Okay. Yeah, oh, question.
Thank you for your talk. Maybe a part of openness is also your personal involvement in research. Did you reflect on that?
Definitely, and perhaps you would forget, this is also my own background. So that's why this was also a very passionate project for me, which I think was great for the in-depth understanding within the actual research process, but also for me, gave me an extra burden to do something, or at least I had the feeling that I had to do something for the community that I feel part of. Yeah, so definitely, but yeah, indeed, well, that's part of, I think, qualitative research, constant reflexivity on your role within the research project. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, maybe during an interview or dialogue. Did that happen, or?
It's a group that is quite hard to reach because some families were really hesitant to tell their stories. I noticed that they felt comfortable with knowing that I knew the stuff they were talking about. So often it happened that at the start of the interview, they would quickly ask me, like, oh, so what is your history? So we'd really quickly tell them that, just to establish a relationship of trust. But in the end, the interview was, of course, about them, right? So then I kept it with them, but especially in gaining rapport and gaining trust, this is my own position.
All right, thank you very much for your talk.